People say I am the best boss. They go, God, we've never worked in a place like this before. And you get the best out of us. I think that pretty much sums it up.
Welcome back to another episode of Good Boss, Bad Boss. This podcast is created in partnership with Share Your Genius. I'm Joei, your host, and today we have an incredible guest joining us, Carmen Cedeño, Senior Director of Demand Gen at Alma. Carmen was one of the first people to reach out to me when I announced that I was creating this podcast. From our first conversation, I was like, wow, she has really high self-awareness and a strong understanding of her own triggers and motivations, which I find are so crucial in being a great boss. I also really appreciated Carmen's emphasis on creating a psychological safe space for her team and supporting them to reach their potential. That's why I thought she needs to come on the podcast. But Carmen didn't have a clear handbook for management before becoming a manager. She learned the ropes by observing other managers, took notes, and created her very own leadership style and handbook. And today, she's sharing all of that with us. Let's get into it. So I'm super excited to have Carmen with me today. We actually have never met in person. We didn't know each other. She reached out to me when I posted on LinkedIn that I'm doing a podcast about good boss, bad boss, and I got a really nice message from her. And immediately I felt a connection from her voice. And so I'm very happy that we're chatting today. Carmen, welcome to the show. Can you introduce yourself a little bit? Tell people who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Joey. Really excited to be spending this time with you. So I'm Carmen. I am the Senior Director of Demand Generation at a mental health care company called Alma. I've been in management roles for 7 years of my career. The other years of my career were more focused on IC roles. But yeah, super excited to be spending this time with you and talk about all things management and leadership.
Yep. Awesome. I'm so glad you're here. First, can you tell us about your journey to becoming manager? Like, did you ask to become a manager or were you asked to?
I feel like a lot of people usually don't ask to become a manager. They kind of are just thrust into it because of some sort of situation in the company. Teams are merging, or that's the only path towards growth, becoming a people manager. But I actually asked to become a manager. There was a position open at a company I was working at for a different department. So they had a marketing team within a different department. And I was really keen on applying for that role because it was more challenging than the role I currently had. And I had just completed a project that I knew was a pretty big deal and would impress the hiring manager. So actually I had cornered him in the elevator. I got in the elevator as well to go grab some coffee. For the first few seconds, it was pretty quiet. And then I'm like, did you see that project I finished? And he was like, yeah, that was really awesome. And I was like, oh, I'm glad you think so. We should chat more because I'm really interested in joining your team. And he was like really surprised at just how forward I was. And he was like, yeah, let's chat about it. And then a few weeks later, we went out on coffee chats, spoke about my experience, what he was looking for. And I ended up getting the role. And when I got the role, he had a team of 80 people. So he had a lot of direct reports, and where the business needed him to focus on was more sales and operations. So I saw an opportunity to start to merge the marketing team and develop an org structure around that. So I was having conversations with him about how I could present a solution to him that would have him focus on what he needed to focus on. And I had good rapport with the other folks on the marketing team. So I was planting seeds to see what that would look like. And in the end, yeah, we ended up merging a few hires together, and I had my own little team. So that was really exciting.
That's awesome. That's such a great story. You knew you wanted something, you went for it, you advocated for yourself, you had leverage because you did a great project, and then you were strategic about the reorganization. That's the playbook. That's how you go get things. So did you have to inherit a team that was already existing?
Yeah, so I did inherit someone, and I had already a good relationship with the person because when I worked in the other department, this person would often come to me asking for help. So I already had a bit of credibility in terms of my work ethic and output. So that was pretty easy to manage. I already had some sense of established trust and respect. But I was also in a situation where I had to inherit a team where that trust wasn't there to begin with. And it's really difficult because trust is something that is not just blindly given, it's earned. So the barrier to entry is much more difficult. Basically, when you inherit a team, everybody's on edge and coping with change, and it's not often that folks respond well to change. So I had to spend the first 90 days just learning a lot about this person. What projects do they wish they had exposure to, but didn't feel like it was their place? What's something they would like to learn? And then, of course, just building rapport and finding out what's important for them for job satisfaction. And I just had to focus a lot on how do I build a psychologically safe space for this person. And what also complicated it is that this person was up for my job. When we got acquired by the other company, there was one role to lead the marketing for the Americas region, and it was between me and this person. And the CMO of the company that acquired us, who was this person's boss, chose me for the role. So that kind of made it a bit easier in the sense that this was a decision that wasn't made by me or my boss. It was outside of our control. And because we didn't know each other, there was no history. So there was just a lot of speculation as to who I am and my leadership style.
Did you have a conversation with this person saying like, look, I know that you wanted my job. We both wanted it. And I know it's not a comfortable situation to be in, but I hope that we are able to build this relationship to move forward.
Yeah, so the conversation didn't exactly go like that. I often in one-on-ones always ask people about their career growth, and I'm trying to figure out how do I make resources available to them so that they can grow in their professional development. And I had asked the question of, where do you see yourself in a few years? And the response the person gave me was, well, I wanted your job. It was just like this elephant in the room because it was pretty obvious that it was between me and this person, this new role. But that was the first time that this person vocalized it to me, and it was awkward, and I don't remember what I said, but I remember appreciating the transparency because then it meant like we knew where we stood, right?
Transparency. I think it's better to get the awkwardness out there rather than having both of you thinking about it but not saying it.
Yeah, and I knew I wasn't going to be in the role forever too. And I was also coping with change myself. I was reporting to a new boss whose management style was really difficult for me. And I felt I had plateaued after being in that role for 2 years. I knew that I was going to have to step up and out for this person to grow in their career. And they really anchored on their success being growth within the company. Whereas for me, that's not the only way towards growth. So when I eventually decided to quit that job, I set them up for success. And now they have my old role.
So you've been a manager for a while now, 7 years. What would you say was the biggest challenge when you had to transition from being an individual contributor to becoming a leader the first time you became a manager?
Yeah, so this is something that no one really talks about, but it's that the skills that made you a successful individual contributor are not the same skills that are going to make you the successful people manager. Like, absolutely not. As an IC, I loved my autonomy and independence. And as a manager, that looks completely different. Every decision I make, every risk I take, every project that I take on not only impacts me, but it impacts folks on my team. So now I can't just think about myself. I have to be conscious of the fact that there is less room for error. And being comfortable with that means I have to lead with transparency. I also have to lead with vulnerability and being honest about what I know and what I don't know, and also accountability. If something goes wrong, I am ultimately accountable and responsible for what happens. And I have to develop the foresight to understand how moving one piece of a puzzle would impact the broader picture, which is something that folks don't often think about. It's no longer just about you, or sometimes not even just about your team. Even something that you take on within your team can have a ripple effect across the entire department or the entire organization. That's something that I had to quickly realize.
I consider myself a middle manager, and I have to advocate for my team enough so that when I present a problem to my boss, he or she doesn't come in and be like, why haven't you done this or that? Because sometimes they'll be like, oh, well, I don't understand why this is a problem. You should have just done X. And we're like, well, we tried X 6 months ago and we already did that. And so I think the communication from the lowest to the highest level needs to be always transparent and open and constant, so that whenever you present a problem from somebody to me and me to my boss, we already know, like, oh, if I say that, it's because we have tried all these different things, or there's certain trust that needs to be built. And sometimes it's the job of the manager to build that trust. And sometimes we need solutions from outside of the team.
I think that people sometimes learn just by seeing behavior and seeing it modeled. So when I have a problem or I'm facing a specific challenge, I make sure to expose my team to that within reason so that they can also see how I'm trying to solve it in real time. Because what I don't want is that folks are going through some sort of problem or issue and they could have asked for help sooner and they didn't.
That's a fine balance, though. Like, how much do you expose or sometimes burden your team with the problems that you're facing? And oftentimes, that could be problems that you're facing with your own manager or people outside of the team, sometimes a little bit political, maybe. I have struggled to find balance of how much do I share, do I not share, and from what position do I share that from? Like, am I saying that, oh, I'm having all of these issues and sometimes I don't agree with certain things? I'm coming at it from the perspective of we're all on the same team and we're making this work. Or like, oh, sometimes it's a bit more divisive where we're clashing and there's a bit of disagreement, and how much of that do I share? Yeah, I don't know if that's something you also have experienced or struggle with at times.
Yeah, I think disagreement is healthy, but I think what makes it healthy is if folks can disagree and commit to the same solution. So even if I might not agree with something, I always try to make sure that I explain my point of view and why I disagree, but what we're committing to. Because what you don't want to happen is that you're seen as a maverick. You're disagreeing just for the sake of disagreeing and you're just being difficult. And I also think it's important for teams to be comfortable with conflict and disagreement. And as a leader, you're not going to be making decisions by consensus. That's also something that is important to establish. As a leader, you sometimes have to make a decision without having everybody's input, and not everyone's going to be happy. And for me, I'm more focused on results versus likability. I'm here to make sure that we achieve our goals. I'm not here to be friends with everybody.
Is that something that you started right from the beginning or something that you learned and adopt as you gain experience as a manager? Like likability and trying to lead by consensus. I feel like a lot of early managers tend to do that and favor one side.
Yeah, I think I've always been like that, but it's just looked different. And it's something that I've seen modeled. And this is part of change management. When you make a decision that not everybody's going to agree with, it's like, how do you communicate it, right? And I think something that leaders do is that sometimes they communicate the decision, but they don't explain the why, and they don't bring people along on the journey. So for me, that's something I learned. I'm not just going to communicate the decision and ruffle a few feathers. I'm going to communicate the decision and the why, and make sure that people feel like they're brought along for the ride and that they at least had input into the decision, that they were heard.
As a manager, you mentioned that, people are watching your every move or they're looking to you for guidance. Or another guest mentioned to me the other day, like how you feel is how the team feels. How do you balance the responsibility of watching your every move versus being authentic with your team? How much do you share, not share? And how do you lead by example at the same time?
Yeah, that's a challenge. I think it goes back to something I mentioned earlier about disagreeing but committing. Even if I disagree with a decision, I have to commit to whatever the decision made is and rally behind that. I make sure to balance that, and I try to depersonalize it when I disagree with something, and I focus more on the why. Why is this decision the best? What informed it? This is what I think it means, and these are the things we'll watch out for. So I try not to let my feelings dictate how I communicate my disagreement. Of course, showing feelings is important because we are humans. I try to lead with transparency. So if something is frustrating me, I might vocalize, I find this very frustrating. But I don't leave it at that. I don't say, this is very frustrating. I say, this is very frustrating, and this is what we can expect. So it's that duality of, yes, this is frustrating. This is a decision that doesn't sit well with me. And I know that if we do this, this is what will happen, or this is what this means for the business. I used to have a boss that when he would lead through change, this was pre-pandemic when people were in offices, and he'd say something like, if you can stick around for, each change we make, inch by inch by inch, it's going to feel difficult. But once we get through the other side, it's going to be so much better. And here's why. And that always stuck with me, because when you zoom out and look at the grand scheme of things, it helps make a decision feel much easier to navigate.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that in hindsight, a lot of those frustrations that I was feeling was actually just because I didn't see the bigger picture, or I was focusing on one aspect when certain decisions need to be made for the greater good for the bigger team. So definitely something that I've learned the hard way. There are things that you should just keep to yourself or to your friends or to other people that are not your direct reports. In the beginning, I was blurring the lines because to me, it was very important for me to have a personal relationship with all of my direct reports. And I say to them, our relationship comes first before the professional side of things. I think I go too much into like trying to be friends with them and then valuing that a bit more than the professional side of things that make it difficult to bring up more difficult conversations, challenging decisions. And now there are friends to vent to, and then I can journal, I can like meditate and let the emotions out. And then when I'm with my team, I am leading from, a higher place where it's productive, it's positive.
I get that. I mean, when you become a manager and a leader, you have to be comfortable with the power differential because it does exist. And I'm someone that struggles with a power differential because I'm very used to working in organizations that are typically flat. But now, to your point earlier, I have these layers of complexity where I have managers of managers, and also in other teams, there are managers of managers, and I have to make sure that I am a good steward of decisions or just a good representation of marketing leadership, not just myself. And because of that, it's a balancing act. So it's difficult. And I think to your point, it's kind of taking stock of how can you lead with transparency and vulnerability in a way that's going to result in the outcomes you want to see. If I'm going to lead with transparency and vulnerability, it's not for the purpose of becoming friends with people. It's with the intent of helping people understand the decisions I make, how I operate, what I'm thinking about as well, what business challenges am I facing that they might have something of value to add, and also just so folks feel comfortable with sharing whatever issues they're coming across.
Honestly, I've been loving everything you've been saying, and it sounds like you're leading from a place of maturity and that you've learned how you want to show up as a leader. Where and from what would you say you've learned the most about management and leadership in your career?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it sucks because there's never a handbook for how to manage and how to lead. There is no handbook. And a lot of people are just thrown into it and they just learn by trial and error. So I would say that I learned from two distinct things. One is just my sphere of influence. So leaders I've been exposed to, whether they've been leaders that I've admired or leaders that I didn't really admire. I learned what I should and shouldn't do, or what I wouldn't want anyone to experience if I was their leader. And then I think about my own team, right? And how I learned as well just from receiving feedback from my team, because there have been situations where I've made mistakes. Because there isn't a clear handbook, you're thrown into this fire without any sort of safety vest. So really you learn through exposure and experience, and that's been my scenario.
Is there one or two more memorable experiences that you felt that there was a pivotal moment of, okay, that was a really big hard lesson, that after that it changed how you perceive yourself as a manager or show up as a manager?
I think about one experience. This was when I became a manager for the first time. This was pre-COVID as well, a very long time ago. So we were in an office and I just hired someone for the first time. And this person used to sit next to me. And when they would ask me questions, I wouldn't turn around to look at them because the questions were easy and quick. So I just keep typing and I would just answer them and, keep going. And then it was in a one-on-one that the person was like, when I ask you a question, you don't look at me, and like, it really bothers me. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I didn't really think about that, because I'm thinking to myself, why do I have to look at you? This is a very quick and easy answer. You're asking me a question while I'm doing something, but I didn't try to justify the why. I accepted the feedback, and what that translated to me for was just being present And to your point, yeah, like learning what people are looking for, because there were some people on my team that didn't really matter to them. They would do the same thing. They wouldn't look at me and they'd ask questions and I wouldn't look at them and that would be it. But for this person, this mattered. So I had to learn that I had to flex my leadership style and how I show up based on what people need. And I had to do it in a way that would also make sure that I would get the best out of them. So if someone perceives that as me being dismissive or not engaged, they're probably going to interact with me the same way or develop some resentment. I don't know. So I think about that being a pivotal moment for me.
I love that, because I think sometimes we get used to a certain type of communication and then we think that's just how everybody is. And in fact, everyone is so different. I have people in my team that loves working remote. Some people love being in the office and they need different things from me. Sometimes I feel like, oh, the most competent people, they're super autonomous and I can just let them be. But actually, they're always waiting for me to show validation or approval or sometimes appreciation. I didn't know those things until maybe a performance review come up. And it just reminds me that I always need to check in and be like, is this going in the right way? Are you happy? And how do you think it's different managing managers versus just managing individual contributors?
Yeah, it's so different because when you manage someone directly and they're an individual contributor, you're more hands-on with them and you can influence the decisions they make a bit more directly. But when you're managing a manager of a manager, you have to take a step back where they have to make decisions themselves based on their ability and their strategy. And you have to coach them to think about how their decisions are going to impact the broader team and also business outcomes. That's the difference. And it can be very tempting, especially when you see an area of opportunity, to want to tell the person directly, like, hey, I see this and this is what you have to do. And I've had to hold myself back a lot of times, because what you have to do in those situations, or at least what I do, is that you kind of have to coach the person into coming to that solution themselves, arriving to it. Of course, if it's taking them a long time and it's detrimental to the team, you have to step in and be like, okay, this is what I'm seeing and you need to do this. But yeah, it's just very different because for me, at least, I don't want to come across as being too involved, and I want to give them the space to form their own little pod and their own leadership style and culture. So it's a challenge, but what I do is that I do skip levels with anybody who doesn't report directly into me. So once a month, I talk to those folks. I ask them what they're working on. I'll ask questions about challenges and also just management, like how's it going? Is there something they want to share with me? When I do that, I always let the manager know, like, hey, my skip level with so-and-so is coming up. This is what I'll ask. And if there's something worth surfacing, I'll bring it in a one-on-one and be like, hey, this is something I think you should think about or look into. But yeah, that's how I navigate that.
That's great. What would you say is your biggest managing challenge today that you're kind of still struggling with, or an area that you want to work on?
I would say that a challenge I'm navigating now is what's next for my team, because the team I manage has been established for like the last 3 years. So we have a pretty mature motion in terms of what we do and the outcomes that we drive. But as new business opportunities crop up, now I have to consider, okay, I have this larger team. What does this mean in terms of growth opportunities for this person, that person, and moving that piece of the puzzle and understanding how it impacts the overall picture, and making sure that I'm not making promises to people in terms of growth or opportunities, because anything can change. It's a startup. So that's been something that I'm navigating, and it's of course a challenge, but a good challenge to have, I think.
Yeah. There are people in your team who's asking for their next step and you don't have a clear visibility and you're trying to work that out together with them, because I'm facing those and I do want to keep them and I know that they're great, but sometimes I can't offer them what they're asking for, and that's where it gets tricky.
Yeah, so a lot of people on my team actually haven't reached their 1 year. I only have a few people that have been, they're pretty new, but of course it's probably on their mind. What's next? How do I grow? And I think about how do I communicate the opportunities I feel comfortable communicating that to them in a way that seems like a growth path for them. I actually, instead of talking to them about what opportunities exist, I spend a lot of time just understanding what do they enjoy doing and what are they good at, and seeing where these two things overlap with what the business needs, and focus more on just developing their skills in that discipline versus this is a project that's going to come 12 months from now and I want you to lead it. It's like, well, let's take a look at what your skills are and where do you need to develop.
So now I want to talk about something that a lot of managers have to experience or will probably experience in their career, which is delivering bad news, having to let someone go when it isn't really your decision. Did you have that experience? How did you handle that? And what's going on in your mind at that time?
Yeah, delivering bad news is never a good time for anybody involved. And probably one of the hardest situations in anybody's career as a leader is that they eventually will have to deliver bad news. And very early on in my leadership trajectory, I was put in a position where I had to deliver bad news, and that was letting someone go. And because I take my team's well-being very seriously, anytime I have to deliver bad news, I have such a heightened sense of anxiety. And I remember just feeling angry because it was a decision that was made that I wasn't consulted on. And even though it wasn't my decision, I was being told that I had to deliver the news. This was a merger and acquisition that a few things could have been handled better, a good case study. But all that was going through my head was like, how is this going to impact this person's livelihood? Do I take the risk of giving this person any hints about what's coming before HR? And I just had so much respect for the person. So it really bothered me. And I just had to make sure that the way that this news would be delivered puts the person at the center of it, making sure that they have the resources they need and are able to navigate the change in the most gentle way possible. And it's never gentle. And I've seen layoffs where the company or the news is focused on why the decision was made and like it's about the business, and it never centers the person. So it was more about how do we center this person and make sure that we are focusing more on what they need. So you have to get straight to the point. There's no beating around the bush. This is what's happening. It sucks. I'm sorry. Let's talk about what next steps look like and how we can support you and like any questions you have that we can help answer. And everybody's going to react differently. So you have to steel yourself and make sure that you're not letting your emotions show too heavily. Of course, you want to.
Because sometimes it can backfire. I was in a similar situation where I tried to do it right by the person and I was showing maybe a little bit too much empathy. And sometimes you say things that you're not supposed to, or it can put the company at risk when you show too much of your emotions. Or sometimes you're saying it just because you want to be human, but actually could backfire and lead to dire consequences.
And that's why a lot of people always say, like, never tell the news without HR, because it's so delicate. To be honest, it's very obvious when you're sticking to a script. People can see through it. So I don't find that authentic. We've seen on the news all these companies announcing mass layoffs and how they stick to a script, and the script is still bad. How do you center the people that are being impacted by it and make sure that it's coming from a place that is people first versus business first? No one who's being laid off cares that, oh, because the company hasn't hit profit, that we had to do mass layoffs. No one cares about that. Like, that doesn't impact them. What they want to know is what's next for them and what is the company going to do to help them navigate it.
So I think what you mentioned there is also heavily dependent on the company culture. Do you work in a company where there's, a good culture, where it's people-centric, where you know that even when tough decisions need to be made, you are able to have some space to offer, whether it's severance, whether it's an approach that's humane? How have you learned about what works and what doesn't, depending on how the company culture is, if that's something you can speak to?
Every company is different, to your point. So there are some companies where, for example, like our CEO has office hours. So because he has office hours, a lot of people know what's top of mind for him. They have exposure into how the business outlook is performing. And when there isn't inherent transparency built in, which I've been in situations where that has happened, it's difficult to navigate, because at that point, you're trying to figure out yourself how to navigate the situation, how to deliver the news in a way that feels authentic to you. And I'm going to be honest, sometimes Google is my friend in those situations. I'm Googling, how do I navigate this? Or I'm asking peers, how did you navigate that? That's what helps me. And anytime someone is let go or they willingly quit their job, I always do my own version of an exit interview because people are very honest during exit interviews. They have nothing to lose. So they're going to be really honest. And I mean, if you're at a company that doesn't do exit interviews, that's a problem in itself. And if they don't, you can conduct one to understand what you can change within what you can control. But it's very difficult.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that the best conversations that you have with someone is when they've decided to leave and then they start to like tell you everything and you're like, wow. Speaking of saying everything, you've mentioned that you like to lead with transparency and radical candor and you're someone that speaks their mind. Do you find that it's more a positive or a negative thing? Probably more positive since that's your approach. But do you have advice for people who want to speak their mind more often but might worry about people looking up to them or holding the company line or, that kind of thing?
I think that you have to be conscious of who your audience is, who are you communicating with, and what level of trust is there or influence there is before you communicate honestly, because you can always communicate honestly and with candor, but you have to do it in a way that takes your audience into account. So there are people at my current company who I don't have a relationship with, and I have to be conscious of how do I show up in a way where they don't see my candidness as a threat. So in those situations, I tend to listen more than I provide my feedback to start to develop trust. And if I'm going to share my feedback, I try to do it from a place of curiosity. So more just, I'll state my intent. Like, I'm asking these questions because I'm seeking to understand this better, or I like to provide feedback because this is what I see. And we actually did a little mini training with my team about how to deliver feedback. And there's this SBI framework that a lot of people talk about, which is like situation, behavior, and then intent. I think when delivering feedback, making sure that you're also stating the intent, especially if someone doesn't work with you closely and doesn't know you. And that's how you can make sure that you remain authentic to yourself if you're someone that's communicating honestly.
So I think I'm going to go to the rapid fire questions, if that's okay with you. Are good bosses born or made?
They're made with the right resources and support. They are definitely made. They are not born.
Great. We have hope. What's one myth about being a boss that you want to debunk?
That managing people is the only way to be a good leader. You can be an IC and also be a standout leader. Managing people isn't the only way, and that's because you have to anchor on your ability to influence and effectuate change, and you don't have to be a people manager to harness those skills.
I love that, and I feel like you were doing that before you became a manager when you were talking about how you were already offering help to other people, and it made your transition so much more smooth because you were already offering help and showing up, and you can definitely be a leader without being a boss. If given the choice, would you prefer to be a manager or an IC? Individual contributor?
I enjoy being a manager because I like working with people, and I feel good about the fact that I can influence people's career trajectory and their lives just with the decision and resources that I make available to them. So yeah, I like being a manager.
If you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of management advice, what would it be?
Don't be afraid to ask for help. I am a very solution-oriented person, and we spoke about this earlier. People tend to want to work out through the problem, and by the time it reaches leadership, they've tried a bunch of different solutions, and I am someone like that. I like to present solutions. I don't like to present problems, but there are times where two heads are better than one.
Could have asked for help earlier.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I do feel like there was a time where I thought when I present problems, I'm showing my boss that I can't do things and I can't handle things. And so I wasn't showing any of the problems. It's like I just show the math without showing how I work the math through. But then later I realized, actually, no, it builds a relationship with your boss too. And so much better to just be open and just show that you've tried to work it out and not like, oh, here are all my problems. But there's a way to share that. Okay. Is there any book or resource that had a significant impact on your management approach?
Rather Than Candor by Kim Scott. Yeah, I love that book.
Same. I do love that. Another one that I really like is The Making of a Manager. I don't know if you've read that one. It's pretty good. In one sentence, what does being a good boss mean to you?
Being a good boss means that you're someone who can motivate, inspire, and effectuate change through authenticity and transparency. That's what being a good boss means to me.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that so much. Well, thank you, Carmen. This was super interesting. And obviously, we can talk for hours, but I really appreciate your transparency and how generous you've been with sharing your experience. So I hope that was fun. Anything else that you wanted to add or think we might have missed?
No, thanks for having me, Joey. This was so great, and I appreciate talking about the things that no one talks about openly.
I could have spent all day talking to Carmen about transparency, balancing personal and professional relationships, understanding how to give and receive feedback effectively. Her experience honestly just gave me so much to think about as I lead my own team. If you have a story that you want to share or relate to the topic today, I'd love if you can leave me a voice message on SpeakPipe. The link is in the show notes. I may feature your message on an upcoming episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to share with someone, rate and review. You can subscribe to my Substack so you don't miss another episode. I'll see you next time. Bye.